In this video, we'll be learning how to create an animal in clay and then cast it in concrete. This will yield a permanent sculpture that can be sited outdoors in your front yard or at someone else's place. We're using a coarse red clay, coarse red earthenware, but to start, we'll make an armature, which is a wooden structure that'll support the clay. The clay we're using is a coarse red earthenware from Continental Clay. These are some of the tools that are handy to use, and I like to have a lot of reference photos to use when I'm doing the sculpture. This is just a very basic rough armature, but it'll be adequate for our purposes. When we build the armature, it's nice to use single screws so that you can twist it around if need be, so you're not locked into any one position. So here's our clay. You'll want to make a wire clay cutter for cutting the clay, because it's really hard to just grab chunks off with your hands or cut it off with a knife. But wire cuts through the clay really nice and cleanly. So attach a length of wire to a couple of pieces of wood, keep the wire under tension, and cut some slices. Now when you start building your animal, build it up out of these slices of clay instead of trying to kind of carve it out of a big chunk of clay. Use an additive technique first, and then you can reduce it later. You can use your photographs of animals to take measurements, and you can also look up on Wikipedia the actual sizes and measurements or images of the animal's skeletons or anatomy. As much data as you can get will help you do a convincing version of your animal. So do your research, take your ruler out and measure those photos. Think hard about the actual shape of the animal in motion. Think hard about the skeleton that is underneath the animal. And just keep that in your mind as you're laying up the clay. You probably won't be working quite this quickly. And when you're partway through, check back to see how accurate your measurements are. I discovered here that I'd made his neck way too short, so we have to pull his head off and move it up. The faces of animals are key to a feeling of life and identity. Predators, like this otter, have eyes that face forward. Prey animals, rabbits and deer, have eyes that face the side. When making animal faces, it helps to have studied the skull of the animal. Eyes, for instance, are much larger than they appear from outside. The eyeball of this otter is much larger than the bit you can see outside. And if you create the socket, insert the eyeball, and then build the eyelid, it makes a much more convincing face. Now we're getting closer. There's still fine finishing to do, and we need to double check our measurements, but we're getting close. Pay attention to the details of noses and ears. They too are really distinctive in each type of animal. Okay, this is the mold material that we use to make the rubber mold. We'll make a rubber glove mold to go over the animal first. I get mine from a company called Smooth On. You can find them on the web. You can find everything on the web. Smooth On Mold Rubber Company. This is Rebound, which is a really useful kind of mold rubber. It's not as sensitive to light as some. It has a 1-to-1 mixing ratio, so it's really easy to use. You pour equal quantities of the mold rubber and the catalyst into a pot, and you mix it up until it's all the same color. With this particular mold material, half of it is white and half of it is bright pink. You pour them together. You mix them good until it's all the same color, and there's no more streaks of white in there or pink in there. And then the first coat you put on thin, like this, and it is thin. It's very flowable, so it gets in all of the crevices and all of the little details. So you want it to be thin like that, and you want it to flow like crazy. That's why it's pooling all around the sculpture. It'll take, about an hour or so to set up, maybe a little longer. Give it a little longer. It depends on how hot it is. This is very heat-sensitive stuff. Now what we're doing is we're preparing the second layer of mold material, and this particular layer will be thickened. Smooth-on rubber comes with a thickening agent, which you can use to make it get much thicker. There it is. You use just a few drops, not too many, and mix it all up together like you did before. But this thickening agent will make it much thicker, kind of trowelable instead of brushable. The first layer is brushable. The second layer you put on with a stick or with your hands. I can't tell you often enough, wear gloves, because this stuff doesn't wash off of anything. Wear gloves and wear old clothes, because you will not be able to get this stuff off your clothes or your hands or anything else. So wear your rubber gloves, and you can see how much thicker this particular rubber is. You want to get a good, half-inch thickness everywhere on the mold. You don't want it much thicker than that, because then it won't stretch nicely like you want it to. But you don't want it much thinner than that, because then you run the risk of mold failure in the thin spots. So look for spots that are where you can still see the brown clay, and build it up over those spots. And don't have spots that are super thick, because, as I say, those spots will not stretch. So try to make it a pretty uniform half-inch thickness all over the whole thing. Now that mold rubber will set for, again, leave it overnight. Ann Klefstad is a fiscal year 2021 recipient of a Creative Support for Individuals grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board. This activity is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.